Next up, we have a good friend of the ETHDenver community. We have Kevin Owocki coming to us from Boulder and from the Gitcoin project. Kevin's been part of the ETHDenver community and all of our gatherings from the beginning. Big proponent of the Colorado crypto scene. We're so happy to have you back, Kevin. Woo-hoo!
Hi, Shannon. How's it going?
Really well, thanks. I'm excited to listen to you present today. You're talking about a subject that's near and dear to my heart. And
hi, Kevin.
How's it going?
Stoked to have you as well. So today you're going to be talking to us about the quadratic lands, and I will let you take it away.
All right. Thanks so much, Shannon. Just sending a tweet to let everyone know that I'm going on a couple minutes early. Hopefully we get a couple more people checking us out from that. So I'm going to share my screen, and we are going to talk about the quadratic lands and the principle of the consent of the governed is the updated title of my talk. All right, so there we go. All right, so this is a topic that is near and dear to my heart, and it's one of the reasons that I got into the blockchain space, is this idea that we could build more democratic systems using our digital age technologies as we transition from the industrial age, in which the organizing principle for our society was institutions, to the information age, in which the organizing principle for our society is a little bit more of the web. And one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about in terms of the context of that transition is this principle in political philosophy of what's called the consent of the governed, which basically refers to the idea that the legitimacy and the moral right of a system, or in the case of governance, a government's legitimacy, but also in the case of a web system, which increasingly dominates our lives. The foundational principle is that the consent by the people or society upon which that political power is exercised. And so this theory of consent is sort of historically contrasted from the divine right of kings and sort of the history of colonialism in the West. And so I'm going to try to apply some of these principles to our web-based systems and see where it goes. And the starting point that I want to begin with is Web 2. And I think that we're all familiar with, in the blockchain space, this notion that in Web 2, you are the product. If you sign up to Facebook, then your attention is being sold to advertisers. If you sign up to LinkedIn, then your data and attention is being sold to recruiters. And so there's this feeling in the blockchain space that we've grown past the scale of these systems in such a way that there are hundreds of millions of human beings inside of the web that are all being bought and sold, and there isn't the consent of the governed to all of these practices. Yes, maybe in the sense that you've checked a terms of service that you didn't really read, that gives people that gives the legal right to do this, but there isn't really an alternative to Facebook where you can take your data away from Facebook if you want to withdraw their consent and use a comparable service. And the same thing with tons of different Web 2 apps. And so as we study this idea of how Web 2 apps got this way, it's really a story of network effects, where when a lot of these websites start out, they're really trying to attract users to come to them. And eventually they hit this network effect where every user that joins makes the experience better for every other user who joins the platform. And then eventually over time, the platform will move from attracting users to finding ways to extracting users. And then on the sort of platform relationships to its complements, sort of you're building on top of the Facebook API, if you're building on top of the Twitter API, these platforms will move from cooperating with them in the early days when they need to broaden their reach to competing with them once they are inevitable. And I think that this is sort of what undercuts the consent of the governed in Web 2 applications. There's also this deeper, more foundational aspect of human economic systems called the Matthew effect, which is basically the effect of accumulated advantage. For short, it's sometimes called the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. But it doesn't just apply to money. It applies to matters of fame or status or power, anything where the cumulative advantage can compound over time and lead to capture of a system, thereby reducing the consent of the governed. And so, my basic feeling is fuck the Matthew effect, fuck the consolidation of the web. We need to build something better in the blockchain space, and we need to move from systems that say they can't be evil to systems that won't be evil. And the big question for me is, how do we blow up the Matthew effect? How do we blow up the network effects of these Web2 companies? And how do we, at a time in which humanity's experience is increasingly intermediated by the online, by the digital, how do we blow up the Matthew effect? How do we reverse this? And so I have this sort of like visual conception of a portal to somewhere where the consent of the governed remained intact, where we didn't have the Matthew effect, and everyday people, the poor and the many, could stand up to the rich and the few. And I'm calling that the quadratic lands, a place where there's more digital democracy and a place where the preferences of the poor and the many outweigh the rich and the few. And so let's go into that portal, into the quadratic lands. I think a foundational building block of the quadratic lands, of the consent of the governed in the Web3 era, is Ethereum, which I think that we can conceive of as a technology platform, but I also have started to think of it a little bit like a city, in that it's more than any one firm or any individual. It's actually a community of loosely affiliated individuals who agree about their location of work and their residence, in the case of a city, or in the case of a protocol, what unit of account they use for their financial lives. And I think that you can look at it in that context of a city, and within that city, communities will organically start bottling up from a bottoms up perspective. So a place where people dissatisfied with the status quo to gather, experiment in creating new economic systems. I like to say Ethereum is a Schelling point for the hopeful. We don't all exactly know what we're building in this space, but we know that we're trying to build something that's better for the world than what exists in the status quo. And so the exact tools that we're using in the Ethereum space are programmable money in order to program our values into our money. We've got immutability, so you can build systems that live past you, and we can go from won't be evil to can't be evil. Transparency, so that you can inspect what's going on in the system. So basically what we're doing is creating transparent economic games that can't change on you. And this is why when people say that they don't believe that Ethereum can make a difference, or they believe that we're just creating a new oligarchy in a new place in order to get away from the old oligarchy, I say no. Now we're building transparent economic games that can't change on you, and that's why this is such a foundational piece of building this portal to the quadratic lands. Is that I, as a programmer, could create a system that can't be evil, that can't consolidate against the everyday people, and I think that that's really, really powerful. Because what I want to do in my community and in my presence in the digital space is try to build more bentoism into the economy. And so bentoism is this idea from Yancey Strickler from Kickstarter, which basically says, hey, how about instead of just optimizing for, if you look at life as an optimization game, if you look at our economy as an optimization game, instead of just optimizing for instant gratification, what if we were to optimize for what would be good for future me in addition to now me? What would it look like if you expanded the incentives from away from just me into now us and future us? And so we have a bento box of incentives in which we're creating a regenerative force in the economy by focusing on time preferences and community preferences over individual preferences. And maybe we could create a stronger economy together using programmable money and focusing on bentoism. So some of the actual tangible examples of creating some of these systems that I'm really excited about, that I think are a part of my quadratic lands, is liquid democracy. So basically, I think that there's a huge problem with low voter turnout in DAOs in the space right now. I think 2% voter turnout is standard for a lot of DAOs, which I just think is BS. If we're launching governance tokens, hey, let's actually use them for governance. And so there's this idea of liquid democracy, which is a form of delegative democracy, whereby an electorate has the option of vesting voting power in delegates, as well as voting themselves directly. So basically, you could have a system in which there's a group of senators that have the consent of the governed, and they aggregate the consent of the governed, and they're the ones who have the time and willpower and connections to actually be involved in the governance of the system. And the consent of the governed can be revoked at any time if you don't like what your senator has voted for. And that's why it's called liquid democracies, because you can revoke your consent at any time and you can move it over to anyone else. So I would like to see more of these Web3 systems that have the consent of the governed and actually have high engagement from the governed in the form of high voter turnout, and liquid democracy is one way that we can get there. I think another great way to get to the quadratic lands is to create systems where we own what we use. Tokenized ownership can allow us to create web-scale cooperatives that allow users to become owners, aligning capital and labor and management of these systems, you know, assuming it's not just a protocol that's completely neutral, can have aligned incentives between investors and the people that are in the system. And so I've been on enough startups to know that sometimes when things get rough, your investors want to know where their return is going to come from. And sometimes that can come from extracting from the users. It can come from chipping away from the consent of the governed when you already have that network effect going. And I don't want to build systems like that. I want to build systems that are more democratic and have the consent of the governed, because I think that that's how we're going to scale this space to web scale. So one of the ideas that I think is really kind of interesting when we're looking at building digital democracy is this idea of quadratic voting. And basically, there's two problems with on-chain governance, I think. One is low voter turnout and low engagement. And then the second is this thing of plutocracy, which basically is the Matthew effect. It's compounding gains of accumulated advantage. And basically, quadratic voting can counter that because quadratic voting is a collective decision-making process where individuals allocate votes to express the degree of their preferences rather than just the direction of their preferences. And basically, you're voting with your identity, because the more vote credits that you spend on any individual vote decay in the amounts of votes that you actually expend. And so quadratic voting is just this way of prioritizing the preferences of the poor and the many over the rich and the few, and also expressing a degree of preference instead of just a direction. And so it's, I think, a key to this portal to the quadratic lands that we want to build. Quadratic funding is something that Gitcoin Grants is famous for, and I don't mean to bury the lead. I know that this is what I get invited to speak about a lot of things, and usually it's related to quadratic funding. It's basically this way of taking quadratic voting, and instead of voting with a voting credit, you're voting with your actual capital. And so basically it allows you to express a preference and also degree of preference in which you can spend your capital on it. And basically, the way it works is that you have a central matching pool that is allocated alongside a crowdfunding campaign. And that central matching pool is allocated to different initiatives based off of the number of contributors for each initiative, more than just the amount funded. And what's really cool about this is that it pushes power away from the edges, away from whales and power brokers, and more towards democracy. And I think that that's what we're trying to build in this space. We're trying to empower everyday people to be a part of their economic systems. In reality, quadratic funding is live on Gitcoin Grants. It's no longer just a theory. We've run 8 rounds of funding worth $4.5 million. And I am super proud to say that we've created this graph of preferences amongst the Ethereum community around what public goods they want to see supported. So this graph on this slide right here, each node in the network is a user or a grant in the network, and each edge is a funding transaction within that network. So we can now measure not only the preferences, but the degree of preferences of the Ethereum community in which pieces of open source software, foundational pieces of their infrastructure, they want to support. And so super proud that Gitcoin is playing a small role in funding public goods and creating more digital democracy in the Ethereum space. And I hope to see other people take this concept in many different directions, and we can fund more public goods in the physical world and in the digital world using quadratic funding. But I would warn you before you go forward on this journey, young adventurer, that you need digital identity to create reputation, and which allows us to create trust. Digital identity can allow us to go from one CPU, one vote, or one token, one vote, to one human, one vote. And that's why I think digital identity is a key to the quadratic lands. If we want to create digital democracy, we have to be able to weed out the bots from the actual people. And so this is a foundational piece of our exit from the dark forest and our entrance into the citadel of community and of richness. Because once you have reputation, you can see who you're interacting with, and you can build trust with them based off of their past behaviors and based off of their reputation that they're staking in every interaction with you. Reputation is a foundational part of our social lives, and we can build it into the Web3 space. So my call to action to you is, let's take the journey to the quadratic lands. Let's fucking destroy the Matthew effect, and let's restore the consent of the governed to the web with the blockchain ecosystem. So thank you so much to ETHDenver for having me. Y'all are amazing. Colorado is the blockchain epicenter of the United States. And I really tried to one-up your flashy, shiny neon branding with my shiny neon branding. I'm not sure who came out on top, but either way, I am just so happy to be at ETHDenver and hanging out this year, and looking forward to being in person next year at the Sports Castle.
Thanks, Kevin. We're so happy to have you back. That was awesome. We had some good comments in the chat. If you've got a couple more minutes to hang out with us.
Sure.
One of the ones that really stuck out to me, if I can speak in English, Joshua was talking about how we have consensus, that's all on chain. And so what happens when gas fees are too high? Do we now end up with a different form of people being excluded based on priority and their own funds?
Yeah. I believe that this is a problem. I think that the Ethereum mainnet that we see right now basically requires you to be a thousandaire or a millionaire to do trades on Uniswap. And I think that the Ethereum mainnet L1 is not the right solution for voting. I see Aryan in the audience, and I know that his experiment CLR fund is working off of XDAI, which I think is a great chain for doing things off of the mainnet. We have ETH2 coming. We have rollups that you can do chain voting if you need to. And also snapshot.page is this really interesting experience in signatures that don't actually get broadcast on chain. And that's a mechanism where you can just vote freely and cheaply without paying any gas fees. So I would like to see more experiments with off-chain governance that can be rolled up into on-chain decisions, just migrating that gas fees. And we're just early in that roadmap. And I think that that's why it's a problem right now. I would encourage everyone in the space who's building something to go look at layer 2s, go look at XDAI. They're a really great way to, in some cases, have near mainnet security profiles at way less gas costs.
That's awesome. Do you want to just tell briefly what you did in Boulder this spring during lockdown around Quadratic Funding?
Yeah, for sure. We launched a project called Downtown Stimulus, which is basically an experiment in quadratic funding that was aimed towards Main Street, or I guess in Boulder it's Pearl Street. But we had a $25K pilot round of quadratic funding that was supporting 5 different local businesses. And we ended up raising, I think it was $15,000 from the crowd, and deployed about $40,000 in total using quadratic funding. And, it was just an experiment, and we kind of YOLO'd it. But I'm proud of supporting our local businesses. Having a livable downtown is a public good. But I think that the main achievement that we unlocked is proving that quadratic funding works just out of Ethereum and out of blockchain, and the psychology actually works in the everyday world. So Google Downtown Stimulus if you want to learn more about that, and maybe I'll link the wrap-up post in the comments here on Airstream.
Please do. I think it's really important that we start talking about how kind of Main Street is actually engaging with this, because right now it's so obvious that we're in an echo chamber for a lot of these things, and to actually see regular people engaging with it and starting to learn about these concepts by being able to actually interact with their own communities. It's really important.
For sure.
Well, thanks, Kevin. That was awesome. We appreciate you. We're happy to have you back.